looks at Scotland Yard's cocaine connection.
Heard the possibility that they were going to ship 3/4 of a ton of cocaine to England. And when I told your authorities that, quite frankly, they thought I was crazy.
Tonight, World in Action reveals the true story behind Britain's biggest ever cocaine connection. The crime was planned by this man, one of the world's most wanted criminals. His partner was this man, a top London gangster who played a double game. It's the story of how over £100 million worth of cocaine was unloaded on the streets of Britain. And it's also the story of the criminal's secret links to the Metropolitan Police. The gang were taped boasting that they had an inside man at Scotland Yard.
So anyway, David heard from the guys at Scotland Yard that Charles had got some problems. And he was 90% sure that
You got a guy in Scotland Yard? Come on. That's like getting a FBI agent here. They're tough to get up.
They have one. I'll tell you how they have done. They've had him for a long time. He got David only 14 months.
You're knocking my whole image of Scotland Yard. I don't want to.
He got the guy paid off. Now, David...
Tonight, World in Action investigates Scotland Yard's cocaine connection. Investigations into the cocaine plot started 4 years ago with the Florida State Police. Their work brings them face to face with the world's biggest drug traffickers.
Over 800 people died in the state of Florida last year alone because of cocaine. They were users, and cocaine killed them.
Do you think the cocaine traffickers are going to bring this same rising tide of deaths to Western Europe?
I see absolutely no way that it can be avoided, because the product is the same, and the results on the human being are the same.
What's your opinion of people who trade in cocaine?
I consider them murderers.
Special Agent Mike Minto fought the mafia in New York and now takes on the cocaine gangs of Florida. In 1985, during an investigation into serious organized crime, he picked up the trail of a man called Charles Flynn. But that's a false name. His real name is Nicholas Krasny, and he's one of the world's top 10 most wanted criminals.
Well, right behind me is the house that Nicholas Krasny purchased in November of 1984. It's on a dead-end street, as you can see, and the main road out front is almost impossible for surveillance. There's no place to park, or there's no place to secrete police vehicles. The only way to do this properly is by air, and that's very time-consuming, as you're aware.
A good choice by a professional criminal.
Definitely.
Nicholas Krasny came to America on the run from his native Germany. He quickly found work with Florida's top drugs traffickers.
His prime role at the time was mostly running shotgun for various loads that went through various parts of the United States. And as the years developed, within 2 or 3 years, he had actually put together a highly sophisticated and professional smuggling organization all on his own. He had met and established relationships with the Colombian suppliers. He also had developed and enhanced a distribution network of people ready to buy the product.
The ambitious Krasny was also a dangerous man. He was a crack shot, practicing every day at this Florida gun club. In 1984, Krasny began planning his biggest crime, smuggling the largest ever load of cocaine into Britain.
We first started to pick up the information. They were talking about possibly bringing in 3/4 of a ton.
How much?
3/4 of a ton. And the authorities in London had the same reaction. Yes, but that was true. That was the original thing, was about 3/4 of a ton of cocaine into the United Kingdom to establish their distribution network.
The British criminals who went into partnership with Krasny were Roy Garner and David Bullen. David Bullen is a 41-year-old former car dealer from Essex with a taste for the good life. Roy Garner is a 52-year-old former club owner. He liked to be seen with the famous. Opportunity Knocks host Bob Monkhouse. singer Lulu, and the late Eric Morecambe. But unknown to the stars, Roy Garner is also one of Britain's biggest ever criminals. He's been active for the last 20 years. Former Detective Chief Superintendent Harry Clement investigated Garner and his associates in the early 1980s.
Roy Garner, of course, from what we learned, was a major criminal. He dabbled in major crime, from armed robberies, receiving stolen property, along the route to arsons.
Where would you place Roy Garner in the hierarchy of London criminals?
If not at the top, very nearly to the top.
A big figure.
And most certainly Mr. Big.
Well, the name Roy Garner surfaced in our investigation, and we contacted the authorities in England, and they informed us that they were very interested in the gentleman who they classified as a major criminal within the metropolitan London area.
But Roy Garner has led an extraordinary double life. For as well as being the Mr. Big of London crime, he's also been Scotland Yard's top informant. He's informed on dozens of serious crimes over the last 20 years.
Yes, and what we subsequently learned much later on the inquiry, that he was an informant. And of course, as an informant, he received money for the information he gave. In the main, this would come from insurance companies through assessors. Normally, it's 10% of the lost property. Sometimes, if it's a very vast amount, it's negotiated. And I believe in 1 year, he aggregated something like £220,000.
So Roy Garner, the professional criminal, was making a great deal of money out of informing on other criminals.
Most certainly.
Roy Garner spent some of his millions making a second home in the Florida sun. Garner is a big investor in the American sport of harness racing and owned several horses which raced here in Fort Lauderdale. He also spent $250,000 buying an exclusive apartment on the beachfront. Here he entertained local friends at poolside barbecues. A regular guest was Peggy Burrows, then a girlfriend of one of the cocaine gang.
What sort of lifestyle did they have in Fort Lauderdale?
Oh, very grand. You don't get much better than that. The condominium was beautiful. It was huge. I don't think I've ever seen one that large before. It was right on the beach, right on the ocean. The view was beautiful. The furnishings were beautiful. It was really very elaborate.
And it was from this lap of luxury that Roy Garner plotted to smuggle the biggest ever load of cocaine into Britain. The first step was to meet with international drug smuggler Nicholas Krasny.
It was a very important meeting. It was a lot of secrecy surrounding it, and it included Roy Garner and David Bullen, and they were to meet with Nicholas Krasny. The purpose of the meeting, I found, was to arrange a drug deal, importing drugs into the UK. Nicholas Krasny would be the seller, and Roy Garner would be the buyer.
In August 1986, nearly 400 kilos of cocaine was smuggled into London and the distribution began. Half a dozen kilos of cocaine at a time were bagged up by Krasny's couriers. Then they would make their way to pre-arranged North London tube stations. Here they would wait to be contacted. They were identified by carrying a distinctive American newspaper. They were picked up, they handed the cocaine over and dropped at the next tube station. The drugs were paid for in separate transactions. Money was stuffed into plastic shopping bags hidden with spaghetti packets. A courier using a black taxi would take the cash to a prearranged London location where Krasny's men would again be waiting. The bag changed hands and the two couriers parted. On one day alone, over £1/3 of £1 million changed hands on the streets of London this way. The team stayed in constant contact with the rest of the gang in Florida. But here, American special agents were secretly taping the criminals as they talked. They were shocked to hear there'd been a leak, and their secret investigation wasn't secret anymore.
A confidential source had advised us that Krasny and a friend of David Bullen's had contacted them and advised that there was heat in Fort Lauderdale not to use the phones, and to be careful who you associate with.
What do you mean by heat in Fort Lauderdale?
Law enforcement attention.
That law enforcement officers here were aware that there was a drugs conspiracy in hand?
Yes, that's true.
But there was worse to come. The secret tapes revealed that David Bullen and Nicholas Krasny had a mole inside Scotland Yard.
David heard from this guys in Scotland Yard that Charles had got some problems. And he was 90% sure that
You got a guy in Scotland Yard? Come on. That's like getting a FBI agent here. They're tough to get
They
up.
have one, I'll tell you how they have done. They've had him for a long time. He got David only 14 months. He told him to come back. Now, when he up, he told him about the Roy Garner.
You're knocking my whole image of Scotland Yard. I don't want to.
He got the guy paid off.
The Scotland Yard mole had told the drug smugglers that they were being taped, but the gang believed it was a telephone tap.
A federal phone tap doesn't come through like that, because what that does, it tapes onto a tape. And then they pull the tape, and they have people listen to the tape for anything that they think.
But who's telling you that it costs money to find? I could find out here. But is it from Fort Lauderdale?
Yeah. Now, can you find out? Because somebody's got to better go down to the telephone exchange and find out. There'll be a telephone man.
I'll find out for you.
I've got to find out.
Krasny would think things out very well before he made any kind of a move, be it England, the United Kingdom, Georgia, or wherever. He would want as much intelligence that was available. By intelligence, I mean anything before instituting a course of action. He would want to know more than the average person.
How does a criminal like Krasny protect himself from getting caught?
By getting as much knowledge as he can beforehand.
About the other side?
Yes.
Krasny was confident he could stay ahead of the police, but he hadn't reckoned with British Customs and Excise. In June 1987, he was arrested by customs officers outside his flat in London's Harley Street. Caught with the last 50 kilos of cocaine, he had little choice but to confess. But after 3 months in custody, Krasny cut his way through the bars of his cell and escaped. Before his incredible breakout, Krasny had made a detailed confession to customs officers. We have obtained it. In it, he talked freely about Roy Garner, the Scotland Yard connection, and why they had no fear of the London police.
Roy Garner's handshake struck me like shaking hands with an eel. He took me aside for 4 or 5 minutes and told me he was interested in procuring large amounts of cocaine for his London market. I remember being skeptical about his assurances. He sensed that and assured me over and over again that he would have no difficulties in moving large quantities. I also remember telling him that from a professional point of view, I had my doubts about moving into an area where the infrastructure, by that I mean the intelligence to do the job professionally, was a complete unknown to me. He told me that his group had information about essential intelligence directly from the Yard, and that whatever would be going on would be known exactly to us. After talking with me for a while, he indicated that he wished to remain in the background, to do all further discussions and arrangements as far as details were involved with Mr. Bullen. Because it was very much on my mind, I asked Mr. Bullen in detail how he was going to manage to get me the inside information that was necessary to do the job.
Krasny went on to tell the customs investigators the details of how he'd smuggled the cocaine into Britain. He also named the gang's inside man at Scotland Yard. Roy Garner was also arrested by customs officers in June 1987. But months earlier, just after the leak to the gang, Garner tried to get himself out of trouble by informing on the crime. He called Scotland Yard and demanded to see the head of London CID. Garner's story was that he wanted to reveal a matter of national importance. That meeting was supposed to be a secret. World in Action has discovered what happened. Garner said,
710 kilos of cocaine was brought into this country in July of this year. Now, if that ain't a national problem to you, God knows what is.
He lied about his part in the drugs plot.
I knew nothing about it till Tuesday. You've got to believe it.
He also lied about his reason for informing. He'd discovered that World in Action was about to screen a previous program into his links with Scotland Yard. He wanted it stopped. In return, he would lead the police to future shipments of cocaine.
I want Granada off my back, and in return, 710 kilos will be arriving here. I know how it's coming, I know when it will come, and I would like to deal for it.
The head of the CID, Mr. Brian Worth, told Garner,
"We'll give it our best shot."
The following day, this letter arrived at Granada Television asking us to think carefully before screening the program. Back at the meeting, Garner openly admitted that he knew about the drugs investigation.
20 or 30% of what I've told you, you already know. Probably more.
He also tried to find out if his partner David Bullen was about to be arrested. He urged the Yard to leave Bullen alone. Scotland Yard accepted his story. Customs and Excise were less gullible. Their officers charged Roy Garner with a cocaine conspiracy. When the customs men brought Garner to trial at the Old Bailey last month, a number of serving and former Scotland Yard detectives gave evidence on his behalf. But this extraordinary scene took place behind closed doors. Press and public were excluded from the court.
I find it incredible and probably unique in British criminal court history that you have a major drugs trial where most of it's in secret, and yet in a neighbouring court with a Czechoslovakian spy, or in the Gibraltar affair where 3 IRA people were shot, you actually have less secrecy in those cases than you do in this. I mean, it's unbelievable.
One of the top Scotland Yard men who gave secret evidence was this man, Detective Superintendent Tony Lundy. He handled Garner as an informant for nearly 2 decades. Mr. Lundy was asked by Garner's defense if he was the source of the leak to the cocaine gang. He denied it. He also listed his awards and commendations.
His reputation is that he's been a very successful detective in the field of major crime.
He's arrested many top criminals.
Apparently so.
But not, it seems, ever Roy Garner.
No, Mr. Jennings, no.
The American agents had planned to send the secret tapes of the gang discussing the cocaine plot to England by British Airways.
Your attention, please. British Airways to London Heathrow, flight 292.
By chance, Tony Lundy happened to be flying home from Florida at that time. He found out about the tapes.
The security man for British Airways requested that we use a couple of Scotland Yard detectives that were already in the United States, staying in Fort Lauderdale, and to contact them. Otherwise, they would be glad to take them, but please contact them first.
They were out here on some other Scotland Yard business?
Yes, yes. He gave me the name of a gentleman, Tony Lundy, to contact here in Fort Lauderdale, which I did. Had in a brief conversation. Mr. Lundy said, no problem. We'd be glad to transport them.
At the last minute, the plans were changed, and Mr. Lundy was not given the secret tapes. Mr. Lundy denies knowing that it was tape recordings he was asked to carry. But that's not how Agent Brees remembers the conversation.
So Mr. Lundy didn't take those tapes back to England?
No, he did not.
Nevertheless, Mr. Lundy now knew that there was an investigation going on in Fort Lauderdale and tapes going back from here to Sergeant Bain in Scotland Yard.
Yes, he did.
Tony Lundy has a controversial reputation at Scotland Yard. In 1980, allegations of corruption were made against him and Roy Garner by an armed robber turned supergrass called Billy Young.
What happened to his information? How was it dealt with by Scotland Yard?
Those appertaining to Garner and other criminals were given to myself and my squad to deal with, and those appertaining to the alleged corrupt police officers were given to another squad.
And who headed that up?
That was Deputy Assistant Commissioner Ron Steventon. He had spent a lot of time in those internal investigation departments of the Yard, and his name was such that he was trusted by outside forces.
Steventon's team investigated allegations about an £800,000 jewel robbery in London's Hatton Garden. Garner was paid a £37,500 reward for informing on the culprits. But Steventon found evidence suggesting that Garner was not the informant and that he was exploiting information given him by Lundy to claim the reward. We've discovered that this evidence so disturbed the then Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Albert Lahn, that he wrote,
Lundy ought to have been above reproach. The handling of informants, especially in respect of the information he conveyed to Garner, leaves much to be desired. Indeed, they are such as to cause serious concern in an officer of his rank.
Steventon's team also reopened inquiries into an armed robbery in Wembley. 3 men, claiming to be police officers, went to the house of a wealthy local businessman in Salmon Street. Once inside, they stole £64,000 at gunpoint. Peter Walsh was the investigating officer.
Were you able to complete that investigation?
No, I wasn't.
What happened?
I was ordered to stop the investigation.
Why do you think you would be ordered to stop an investigation?
Well, the only thing I can think of is if I'm told to stop an investigation, the people telling me to stop it either don't believe the robbery occurred or they don't want it investigated. And if they don't want it investigated, that's because they don't want the perpetrators caught.
Years later, Supergrass Young admitted that he was one of the Wembley robbers. He also claimed that to carry out the raid, they'd hoodwinked Tony Lundy.
Well, they had a telephone number, no address to start with, and they needed the address, so someone secured the services of a police officer to obtain the address. This is according to Young. They got the police officer to do a search.
And it's quite normal for police officers to make this kind of search within Scotland Yard.
Well, to do a search, yes, not necessarily for the services of villains. No, but to do a search, most certainly.
Who did Billy Young say that police officer was?
He said that they'd asked Mr. Lundy.
Young made it clear that Tony Lundy had no idea he was helping set up an armed robbery, but he was adamant that it was Lundy they'd turned to for help.
Mr. Stevenson went and checked that allegation?
So I understand.
And what did he find when he checked in the Scotland Yard records?
I understand Mr. Lundy's name was there.
The Stevenson investigation did not result in criminal charges against Lundy, but Stevenson made his own opinion very clear in his final report.
Lundy has, to all outward appearance, been a successful operational detective, and it is only when all the circumstances of his involvement with Garner are examined that grave doubts must be expressed as to his integrity. It is my belief that Mr. Lundy is a corrupt officer who has long exploited his association with Garner. It would be prudent for the reputation of the force that he should be removed from specialist duty at the earliest opportunity.
Tony Lundy maintains that he was totally exonerated by the Stevenson inquiry. That's not true. We've discovered that he was disciplined for the way he dealt with Garner. But after Mr. Stevenson's retirement, Lundy was given a Good Conduct Medal and promoted. After the previous World in Action about Garner and Lundy, Mr. Stevenson's conclusions were quoted in the House of Commons.
Following your film and some other information, I put down parliamentary questions which got inadequate replies from the Home Office. So I then put down a motion quoting DAC Stevenson, who said that in his view, Lundy was a corrupt officer. There was a major investigation into corruption at Scotland Yard carried out by the South Yorkshire Police. And then Mr. Lundy was suspended and, of course, faced very serious disciplinary charges.
Those charges have been kept secret. We've discovered what they are. Lundy was accused of accepting a gratuity, some fencing for his house, from a criminal colleague of Roy Garner called Stephen Salter. At first, Lundy denied it. Later, he insisted he'd paid for it. But the most serious charge which resulted in Lundy's suspension related directly to Roy Garner's involvement in cocaine. Lundy was accused of leaking police information about the cocaine investigation to Roy Garner after his arrest by customs officers. Tony Lundy has maintained that no one criticized him for this leak to Garner. We've discovered that the Yard took it so seriously that they gave Lundy a criminal caution for a possible offence of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. But Tony Lundy will never have to answer these charges because he's now an ex-policeman. On Christmas Eve, his suspension was lifted to allow him to retire on a sick pension. According to the Met,
after a protracted illness, Tony Lundy has been declared permanently unfit for police work.
This news came as a surprise to those who saw Tony Lundy complete last year's London Marathon while officially sick. Tony Lundy lives here in the Hertfordshire countryside. He keeps fit by running daily. We caught up with him just 7 days before the announcement that ill health would end his police career.
Mr. Lundy, World in Action, we'd like to ask you some questions, Mr. Lundy. Could we talk to you a minute, please? How much did you know about Roy Garner's involvement in cocaine, Mr. Lundy? Why is it that somebody who's so fit as you, who can run like this, is not fit enough to turn up for his discipline tribunal? Well, can we ask you? You were named in a Scotland Yard report as corrupt. Are you corrupt? Mr. Lundy, don't you have anything to say about any of these matters?
Scotland Yard have nothing to say to us either. What they have done during the last 5 years of our investigations is put a surveillance squad on one of Granada's team of journalists and ordered a senior officer to Harry Clement's retirement home in Devon to find out what he'd told us.
Subsequently discovered from friends in the Yard that a report had been submitted on behalf of a very senior officer about the case of me speaking to yourselves. and that he'd gone to the Director of Public Prosecutions for consideration to take action against me.
The Yard wanted to prosecute you for talking to us about Garner and Lundy?
That's what it appeared, yes.
What do you think of that?
Ridiculous.
Last month at the Old Bailey, in spite of Tony Lundy's secret evidence on his behalf, Roy Garner was given 22 years for his part in the cocaine plot. The judge told Garner that he was an evil man. Tony Lundy disagrees. He says the judge and jury got it wrong. Roy Garner is innocent, and the customs prosecution was simply a vendetta.
I've no doubt that there has to be a select committee inquiry into the Metropolitan Police. I've argued for many years that the Metropolitan Police are not fully accountable, that makes it very difficult to control issues of this type, and there just has to be some sort of investigation.